Welcome, Chris Shannahan. Chris is Associate Professor in Political Theology at Coventry University, and he's got an interest in cities, and he's also a principal investigator on a multi-university urban theology project called Life on the Breadline, which we're going to hear a little bit about later. Chris, can I ask you to introduce yourself and help us just to look back? We want to perhaps look at, it would be really helpful if you could help us understand a bit more about what poverty is, but particularly to think about inequality. Can you help us look back and give us some examples of the symptoms of inequality in this country and how it's been growing over the last decade or so?
Yeah, of course. And thanks very much indeed, Mark, for the invitation to share in this conversation. Just for information, as Mark was suggesting, I led a large theology project, a kind of contextual theology project called Life on the Breadline. Everything that I'm going to talk about is kind of rooted in that research. And if you were to Google Life on the Breadline or Breadline research, you'll come across the website. And if you click on the resources sections of the website, there are policy briefs, there are church reports, there are Lent courses, there are a whole bunch of things that are free to download. So anything I forget will probably be on the website. As Mark suggested, one of the things that we've discovered during the research is that, particularly since the 2008 financial crash, levels of poverty and inequality have risen quite significantly in the UK. I want to say a little bit more about that in a few moments, but just a snapshot. 2024, 14.5 million people in the UK living in poverty. 2024, more than 4 million people regularly experiencing food insecurity. More than 4 million children facing holiday hunger. 2008, the year of the financial crash, the Trussell Trust distributed 25,000 three-day food parcels. 2023, they distributed 2.9 million. 280,000 people are officially homeless. 1 million people are still on 0 hours contracts. The stats could go on and could get very boring very quickly. I think the point is that the levels of poverty, the levels of inequality, the levels of structural inequality have deepened and worsened over the last 10 years. The so-called age of austerity, dating to the 2010 general election. I mentioned the phrase austerity, age of austerity, and I think we just need to think about that for a moment or two as we think about what we mean by poverty and what implications that has got for the work that we do within the church. I think the first thing to say very clearly is that in 2010, on coming to power, the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition government consciously chose a policy of austerity and a deeper and longer lasting policy of austerity than was implemented in any other comparable economy. So we were told at the time that austerity measures, 25% cut in welfare spending, massive cuts in youth and community spending, 25% reduction of the welfare state between 2010 and 2019. We were told that that was unavoidable, that was an economic necessity, but we shouldn't worry because we were all in this together. Quotes from George Osborne. Now, forgive me if you kind of pick up a sense of cynicism in my voice, but I've been there, you've been there, and we all know that we've not all been in this together. And we know, I think, because it was admitted by the later Tory governments, that austerity was actually a political choice. It was an economic tool, but the political decision was taken to address questions of debt and apparent overspending by making very large cuts to public spending. So that's the first thing to say. We need to recognize that. And I think as churches, we need to recognize that we weren't all hit equally over the last 10 years. Communities that had already been hardest hit by previous periods of austerity were hit harder again. So women, single parents, Black and brown British communities, people with disabilities, far harder hit than people that look and sound like me. So that's the first thing to say. I think the second thing to say is poverty. What do we mean by poverty? Well, in brief, because I could talk for England about this and that get very boring very quickly. In brief, Martin Luther King, 1964, stands up to receive his Nobel Peace Prize. And as he is speaking, Martin Luther King compared poverty to an octopus whose tentacles, he said, reach into every corner of our world. Why do I say that? I say that because we need, I think, again and again and again, to recognize that poverty is multidimensional. Poverty isn't just reducible to food banks. It's not just reducible, however critically important, to food poverty. On our Life on the Breadline website, we worked with an artist called Beth Waters, and she created a jigsaw image for us. You'll see it if you go on the website. And what we've tried to do with that is to suggest that we need to think about the different faces of poverty, the different experiences of poverty, if we're going to come to grips with it. So here's an example. Let's imagine we're volunteering at a food bank. We give out a food parcel to somebody who comes to visit us. That's grand, that's great. We've done our job, tick. We've loved our neighbour, worked for the common good, ... However, when that person gets home, they can't really cook what we've given them because they can't afford the gas and electric. They've got the heating on too much because the house that they're living in is damp. And so what I'm trying to point to is the fact that we need to address, as churches, I think we need to move beyond a kind of a one-dimensional, however well-meaning, response to poverty to recognize its multi-dimensional nature. That's the one thing to say. And I think increasingly, para-church organizations like the Trussell Trust are recognizing that. So I'm not saying anything desperately original, but let's keep hold of that. Secondly, I think we need to recognize that poverty is systemic. It's not about so-called, to quote George Osborne, shirkers and workers. It's not about so-called deserving, in inverted commas, or undeserving. It's not about whether I've got the will and the wherewithal to pull myself up by my bootstraps. It's about where I'm positioned in life. It's about the structural injustices that we face. It's about that word that Mark used earlier, the inequality that we face. We're not starting from the same starting line, as it were. The playing field is not level. And I think as a church, we need to recognize that. We need to address the 1984, the Anglican Communion introduced, widely adopted now, the marks of mission, suggesting I think it's the fourth mark of mission, that the church is called to quote, transform structures of injustice. I think different Christian denominations have referred to it differently. Some might refer to living out God's preferential option for the poor. Others might refer back to Jesus' mission statement in Luke 4 and the preaching of good news to the poor and release to the captives. So we need to address systemic injustice. Pioneer of liberation theology, Gustavo Gutierrez, called poverty systemic sin. And I think we need to grasp the systemic nature of poverty if we're going to grab hold of it. We also, I think, thirdly, need to recognize that poverty is a form of violence. We don't often think of it in these terms, but Mahatma Gandhi referred to poverty as the worst form of violence, perhaps hidden. It's not as obvious as direct person-to-person or even verbal violence. It might be hidden violence, or what's sometimes called slow violence. But violence it is nevertheless. Unseen, invisible, unheard, but damaging communities and traumatizing families and entire neighborhoods. I think the Grenfell Tower tragedy would be a case in point of the systemically violent nature of poverty and inequality in the UK. I'm going to stop there because I'm in danger of talking for too long about the first question.
That's
I think
so
that's
helpful,
something
Chris.
of the background,
Thank
just a
you.
snapshot.
Thank you. Really, really helpful. Big picture there and helping us see some of the patterns. Can I just maybe explore poverty a bit more with you? So if you go to the Office of National Statistics, they measure poverty in 4 dimensions, don't they?
Yeah.
I was reading it recently. It's around education, housing, employment, and health. And they have only a couple of markers in each of those dimensions that they use to record, and then they create this fantastic map of deprivation across our country. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation has also been a strong voice on what poverty is, and speaking to your idea of it being multidimensional, of it being systemic, and of it being a terrible sort of silent violence, really. But I wonder whether you could, if we were as churches working across a town and wanted to sort of try and create a baseline of which we would measure poverty and how we'd make a difference. Would there be, I mean, you mentioned the octopus and 8 tentacles. Would there be more than 4 things we should look at? Do you have any advice on that, or is that too big a question?
How long you got? It's a really, and this sounds very nerdy and the kind of thing that only an academic could say, so forgive me, but the more you dig, the more complicated the question becomes. Because some people would argue that absolute poverty in the UK has not increased. If anything, absolute poverty, some would argue, pointing to certain statistics, has decreased. However, what we have seen is that targeted poverty has increased. So groups that were already socially excluded, children, marginalised communities, Black and brown British communities, people already in poor housing, have been hit far harder. So levels of poverty have grown in a focused way. So, for example, not all of us actually have seen our standard of living hit that hard in spite of mortgage raises, in spite of cost of living. We've managed okay during the so-called age of austerity, but millions and millions and millions of folk are finding it very difficult to get to the end of the month. So I think the issue, as much as being an issue of poverty, is an issue of a structurally unjust and a structurally unequal society where our experience of life is rooted very much in the context within which we are born, live, and grow up. The life opportunities that we get, I don't want to fall into kind of cliches like postcode lotteries, but there's something in that. I think where we're at does impact on our experience of life. So are there more measures? Well, yes, I think there probably are. I think we can talk about housing, we can talk about energy, we can talk about participation, we can talk about exclusion from political processes, we can talk about energy poverty, we can talk about insecure employment. Unemployment figures are relatively low. But I think that masks the kind of insecurity of insecure 0 hours employment. I think it's also worth recognizing that sometimes I think we can get too blindsided by the perception of a need to define everything in a hard and fast manner. So it's the case that absolute poverty, if we take certain measures, has not increased. But it's also the case that the levels of inequality and the focused experiences of poverty have increased exponentially over the last 10 or 15 years. Trussell Trust is a perfect example, from 25,000 to 2.9 million 3-day food parcels. Now, I would be the very last person to blame it on the Tory government, but ... there's maybe no smoking gun, but I think we can all put 2 and 2 together and make 4, probably. I think it's also worth looking at other understandings of poverty that are perhaps less focused on economics. It's worth checking out the work of the Church Urban Fund, for example. The Church Urban Fund some years ago produced what they referred to as a web of poverty. And that web of poverty talked about economic poverty, the kind of thing we're talking about now, and economic inequality and economic exclusion. But it also talked about what it referred to as poverty as identity, poverty of aspiration, and poverty of relationships. And so I think what it was trying to say was that economic poverty is only part of the picture. It drives exclusion and a sense of powerlessness, but where it's married with notions of stigma, kind of the kind of so-called estate from hell, kind of the shame, in inverted commas, of living in poverty, the sense that certain places are sink estates and all of that kind of language, the kind of stuff that we see, perhaps less than we used to, but the kind of what's sometimes referred to kind of quite indelicately as poverty porn. Some of those kind of TV series like Shameless and Benefit Street that paint a certain kind of picture of kind of lazy, no good scroungers living it large on the dole kind of image. I think there's a complex picture, so we need to think about poverty of relationships, poverty of identity, and knit those together with this kind of jigsaw of the different faces of poverty.
Thanks, Chris. That's really helpful. I take what you're saying there as there are common causes of poverty, common symptoms, but actually probably every individual has their own fingerprint of experience and
absolutely. I think
situation.
we can probably say that poverty itself is multidimensional, and we experience that poverty in different ways. So, for example, the experience of a middle-aged white man is not the same as the experience of a young Black British woman who works in the NHS. Yeah. And I'm not saying one is better or different, better or worse than the other, but our experiences and our life experiences impact on the way we engage and the way we kind of live within our society.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Now, let's think about what can we do? How can we make a difference? You've put together, been involved with Life on the Breadline course, which really helpfully gives us 6 foundations for action. So would you maybe, just mindful of time, but just give us an overview of those 6 foundations?
Yeah, we developed this Lent course back in 2021, and it's free to download on the website, and we're very keen for people to use it and to adapt it in whatever way suits. What we wanted to do was to put together a 6-week course that combined scripture readings, short prayers, reflections, connections with some of the kind of political and theoretical conversations that we've been having today and some of the video material that we produced during the project. So we had 6 sessions, each stands alone, but we hope that people will follow them through. So the first session we called Christian Responses to Poverty. I'm mindful of the fact that there are, if we think about it for more than just a few seconds, a whole range of different Christian attitudes to poverty, ranging from those who would at one extreme, and I'm going to be extreme to make the point, say that poverty is nothing to do with us, poverty is a spiritual curse, it's something that's sent by God, poverty is ordained by God, we are placed where we are, our job as Christians is to preach the gospel and save souls. Now I'm using that kind of language deliberately just to kind of paint a picture. So I think at one extreme we've got the kind of total disengagement. We keep out of politics. We preach the gospel. At the other extreme, we've got strands of Christianity that whether we can refer to the Christian socialist movement or the role that the church has played in the development of the trades unions, or going back in history, the Franciscans, the Chartists, the Diggers, or in a theological context, the emergence of liberation theology initially in Latin America. The notion that in a structurally unjust society, God necessarily has a preferential option for the poor, not because rich people are poor and rich people are wicked and poor people are saints, but because structural injustice contradicts the will of the God who creates us all of equal worth in God's own image. So we got something of that background. We've then, I think, got a range of different responses to poverty. We've got what you might call the kind of the common good approach, the kind of the welfare approach, the love your neighbour, what's sometimes referred to as the Matthew 25 approach, the meeting our neighbour in their pastoral need. That, I think, has been a dominant Christian perspective, and I think it's the Christian perspective that's led to soup kitchens, food banks, breakfast clubs, you name it, down through the years. It's the one that successive governments quite like to partner with because it doesn't frighten the horses. It does good, but it doesn't rattle too many political cages. You got that, I think, through to more campaigning and advocacy and speaking truth to power, in inverted commas. Campaigns around a living wage, for example, campaigns around housing justice, campaigns around homelessness or debt. Those would be in brief. That's the first session. What's poverty? Why do we engage with it? What are some of the different ways in which Christians engage with it? Then we try to get a bit more focused. Second session looks at that phrase of Jesus, love thy neighbor, or love your neighbor as you love yourself. Thinks a little bit about what that word neighbor might mean. Then we begin to talk about some of the things in that session that we've talked about briefly today, the intersection between poverty and inequality and what that means for the way we do our social action, think about our communities as churches. Third, we talk about the intersection between, in inverted commas, race or ethnicity and economic poverty, the connection between race, in inverted commas, and class, the fact that the reality is that not all black or brown Britons by any means, and not all white Britons, but the fact that structurally, politically, economically, it remains the case that poverty and inequality, poverty is much more deeply experienced within the black community than is within the white community. That's a generalization, I get it. But we get people to think about that intersection between race and class and austerity. We then move in the fourth session to talk about approaches to building community. I think we call it deficits and assets or something like that. And we draw on one of our case studies from Birmingham on an approach to Christian community development called asset-based community development. Some of you will be very familiar with it. It's the idea of, rather than expecting the great and the good to kind of parachute in and save us and then make everything okay and then parachute back out again. We draw on the assets, the gifts within our community and build community and address inequality and address poverty and powerlessness together in relationship with one another. It's a much more incarnational approach. The question, however, there is that incarnational and local approach and politically engaged enough to challenge macro structural injustice if it is very locally focused? And that's a question. Then we move on to kind of housing injustice as another expression of inequality and poverty. And we profile the Grenfell Tower case study from our Life on the Breadline project, and talk about the way that in that case, Notting Hill Methodist Church was very closely related to the responses to the tragedy, to the homelessness, and then to broader campaigns around social housing and housing justice. And then finally, we bring it all together in a session that looks at this commitment within the Hebrew scriptures, within the ministry of Jesus, within the marks of mission, to the notion that the calling of the church isn't just to bandage up the wounds of the broken, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer suggested, but to ram a spoke into that wheel of injustice and to transform those structures of injustice. And it's there that we kind of, that sometimes the fur begins to fly, because we're beginning to ask those political questions and ask what implications all of this has got for the ways in which the church engages with politics with a capital P. And it's a question. We can't answer that, but it's a question we need to ask.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. Again, so helpful. As you've explained, poverty is multidimensional and complex, but to give us these ways in through the Breadline course for practical action and making some positive steps is really, really helpful.